This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WeAct Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to The Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we have a very interesting show set up for you this week. In the first hour, we'll be talking about the tragic conditions in Iraq with Stephen Miles, who is the head of Win Without War. We'll be helping to make sense of the situation out there as best we can. In the second hour, we'll be talking about the economic divide that continually threatens to engulf us. We'll be speaking with Joan Entmacher of the National Women's Law Center on some of the very important analyses they've been doing about how the divided economy affects women. We'll be talking with Catherine McFate about Witness Wednesdays, in which people are bringing the stories of the long-term unemployed to Congress in an attempt to stimulate their conscience. And we'll be talking with our friend Sam Riddle from Detroit about the Detroit water situation, which is unbelievable until you hear it. In the last hour, we'll be talking about how economics, politics, culture, and technology come together. We'll be talking with Harry Brown, who has written a book about Bono called The Front Man, that talks about Bono's role as a celebrity philanthropist for the power structure and the global power elite. I think you'll find that very interesting. Julia Kahn of Labor Notes about the Uber software and the taxi labor backlash against it and what that really means for us as a society. And Travis Waldron of Think Progress about the Redskins name and what's going on behind that, as well as the legal battles. So we've got a great hour set up for you. But first, before we go into our Iraq conversation, a little bit of commentary about a joke. Hey, listen, I'm all for humor, even of the darkest kind, maybe especially the darkest kind nowadays, if it can help us take a break from the really bleak realities that surround us. If humor can help us see the world more clearly at the same time, that's even better. But unfortunately, as we're seeing, even the best intended humor can sometimes lead us astray. I'm thinking of Andy Borowitz's piece in the New Yorker on Iraq, which was, if you like Andy Borowitz, and sometimes I do, it was mildly funny, but it was way off base in terms of understanding what's going on in Iraq, and especially in terms of us understanding our moral responsibility there. His headline said, "Pressure on Obama to quickly resolve centuries-old Sunni-Shiite conflict." And that's a joke, right? I mean, how is he supposed to fix it when it's been going on for 1,400 years? But here's the thing. The Sunni-Shiite split is way overblown in the media. As a couple of very smart writers with a lot of knowledge of the area put it in a piece recently, that's like blaming the problems in Northern Ireland on, quote, the Catholic Protestant split that has had Christians at war for 1,000 years. That's not exactly what went on in Northern Ireland. This is not exactly what's going on in Iraq. Sure, there's a division between the Sunnis and the Shias, and sure, at times it's been warlike. But like with Christians, communists, and pretty much every other group, Shias have also fought Shias, and Sunnis have also fought Sunnis. Sometimes Sunnis and Shias have banded together to fight somebody else. It's just not that simple. Other factors are at play here, and that's where our responsibility comes in. You know what really did Iraq in and created this catastrophic situation? Not Sunnis and Shias. Us. First, we pushed Saddam on them, propped him up, and used him for our own purposes. Remember that picture of Donald Rumsfeld with Saddam? There's a reason why we did that. And then later, when Saddam was becoming an inconvenience to, we know which interests, I think, economically, we used 9/11 as an excuse to push our global expansion dreams by overthrowing his government without any thought to what would happen next. No problem, right? We were going to be welcomed as liberators. It was going to be a cakewalk. Well, how did that turn out? The Halliburtons of this world are licking the icing of that cake, and we've got the crumbs. Those Iraqis you see out there killing one another aren't savages mindlessly pursuing a 1,400-year-old war, as Andy Borowitz's piece might have you believe. They're people whose hunger, rage, poverty, and yes, deep violence and ignorance is fueled as much by our own economic policies of exploitation and domination as they are by other factors. Are these people scary, violent, even evil? Sure. But what are we? After all, we're the ones who kept them poor. We're the ones who made them ignorant. We then plunged their world into a devastating war, and now we're supposed to look down our noses at them with jokes and humor in the New Yorker when they respond violently? What do we expect? And by the way, who's been more violent in Iraq than we supposedly civilized Americans? Who's been responsible for more deaths? The extremists slaughter, the ISIS slaughter of 1,700 people, which they claimed to credit for on social media. That's a horror show. It's a nightmare. It's inhuman. It's ghastly. They need to be stopped. But what about our slaughter of 1 million Iraqi civilians, mostly civilians? That's a war crime. So if you want to laugh at something, laugh at the foolishness of Dick Cheney and his daughter Liz being given a platform in the Wall Street Journal to spew their hate. Laugh at the Democrats, like Hillary Clinton, who thought it was smart to vote for this war in the first place because it was politically convenient. Laugh at the news shows who are now booking utterly discredited experts like Bill Kristol to talk about Iraq. That's like booking the captain of the Exxon Valdez to talk about safe nautical techniques. We used to laugh at Billy Crystal. He's the guy who said it's better to look good than to feel good. Remember that? Now it's time to laugh at the bitter joke that is Bill Crystal on our TV night after night. But here's the real joke. Bill Crystal gets to look good while thousands of American soldiers who gave their lives and 1 million Iraqis, mostly civilians who died in this conflict, don't get to feel anything at all. My problem with Andy Borowitz isn't just that his column looks down on the very people we victimize. It also lets Mitch McConnell and all the other Republicans off the hook for a problem today. A problem that they, not the locals of the Middle East, created. Don't look back at war crimes. Remember when Obama said that? Look where that's gotten us, and look where it's gotten him. This hideous and hatred and violence we see on our TV today, it isn't 1,400 years old, and it wasn't started by people in the Middle East. It's 12 years old, and we started it. It's up to us to end it. We have a moral responsibility to step back, reconsider what we're doing there, and then bring in the people who can bring an end to this conflict through peaceful resolution. And that's no joke. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back. As I was saying in that opening monologue, the tragedy right now is Iraq, and you better make sure you get the details right. If a lot of people are being flippant about it now, I took Andy Borowitz to task in the opening monologue. I think there are, of course, and Bill Kristol as well, and Dick Cheney, and a lot of the people who are spreading information with us now to help us clear up some of the confusion and help us figure out what to do going forward is Stephen Miles. Stephen is the coalition coordinator for Win Without War, which is a coalition of over 40 organizations formed in opposition to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and equally importantly, in opposition to the underlying national security strategy which created them. He's a veteran of campaign politics. He's a veteran of progressive causes as well as Democratic campaigning, Democratic Party campaigning. He is a graduate of the London School of Economics, where I did not study 1 year, and has academic expertise in humanitarian interventions and Middle Eastern politics. Stephen, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Good, and obviously these are dark days in Iraq. And I guess question number one for you is, how predictable was this?
Well, I think if you look back over the kind of the long term of what's happened over the last decade, it's entirely predictable. Whether or not this particular uptick in violence, was foreseeable or not, what was clear from the very first days of the intervention in the war in 2003 is that Iraq was in for some really dark days ahead and some very violent power struggles. So, unfortunately, the very folks, you mentioned some of them in your opening monologue, the same folks who thought this was all going to be easy and everything was going to go great starting back in 2003 were wrong, and what was entirely predictable back then is, again, unfortunately, coming true in Iraq.
Now, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, since you had a background in Middle Eastern politics, another thing I did in my opening monologue was a little bit take to task this, and perhaps I should take a second and just explain for those of our listeners who haven't kept up on it. Clearly, there is there are religious and tribal and other splits, geographic splits in the nation we call Iraq. There are multiple affinity groups, for lack of a better term, around religion and historical association and so on. And one of them, this army ISIS, is conducting a very violent uprising against the Iraqi government. and also saying they're going to create a 500-mile path between Baghdad and Syria, and are also doing all sorts of things. And I guess one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, I feel that since it's our moral obligation to deal with, to a certain extent, the problem we've created, even if that's by going away. I mean, we can talk about what we should do, but one of the things I think that's a misunderstanding, even among on the left, is the idea, well, Sunnis and Shias have been fighting each other for 1,400 years. It's never going to stop. I think it's a little more complicated than that, and I think a lot of it has to do with our involvement. I talked about that a little bit, about our propping up Saddam and so on, Saddam Hussein and so on. But what are your thoughts? I mean, is this uprising, is it mostly tribal? Is it mostly geographic? Is religion a marker for other kinds of conflict? What do you think is behind this?
Well, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and we should circle back to what we do, but we should talk about why what's going on is going on. And you're absolutely right to say it's complicated. It's an immensely complicated situation. And the one thing that we should really have noticed over the last decade is that we're very bad at understanding it from the outside. There are a myriad of fault lines out there. One of them is the Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish divide that is commonly talked about, but there's lots of other fault lines. There's lots of divides. There's lots of nationalist feelings. It's a very complicated situation. ISIS has been one of the primary players in this saga, but they're by no means the only one. There's some great reporting out of The Guardian today discussing what's going on in the Sunni community. You have elements, former Iraqi military elements, former government officials, former tribesmen who were leaders in some of the uprisings in the early part of the Iraq War, and then later turned their weapons against Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was, of course, the predecessor to ISIS. In the famous, what's sometimes called the Surge or the Sunni Awakening. Those same folks are now fighting on the side of ISIS against the Maliki government for again, a myriad of reasons. Some of them are because of the repressive sentiments and repressive policies of the Maliki government. There's some other realities that ISIS is better armed and capable of kind of convincing them to fight when they don't really have a choice. So it's a deeply complicated situation. And the one thing that we really get wrong here in America is that we think that this is something easy, that there's good guys and bad guys, that we can figure out who those are, that we can help the good guys, that we can kill the bad guys with these quote-unquote targeted and precise airstrikes. The reality is that any step we take to get involved is going to enmesh us right in the middle of a messy, complicated civil war, and it's not going to be something that's going to be very easy for us to deal with.
We're talking with Stephen Miles, Coalition Coordinator for Win Without War, and I guess that brings up several interesting points, but the first one is the surge. We had all this discussion a few years ago about the surge. Would it work? Would it not work? And then people were saying, you see, we told you the surge would work, and they interpreted that, especially on the right, to mean an increase in the number of troops. But what went along with the so-called surge was paying a lot of, as I understand it, but correct me if I'm wrong, involved paying a lot of people who had been fighting against the Iraqi central government to stop doing that and maybe fight for them. Is there some truth to that?
Yeah, there's absolutely some truth to that. I mean, sometimes called, I said, the Sunni Awakening, but really the violence in 2006, 2007 that we in the U.S. often talk about as the surge, a lot of that was decreased by the time any of the extra U.S. troops got there. And what really happened was a lot of the Sunni militias, a lot of the Sunni tribesmen who were fighting on the side of what was called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but again, a little bit more complicated than that, but was fighting on their side, sided with the Americans and with the central government against them, and began to kind of turn the tide of that insurgency, and brought a relative period of calm in some of the sectarian violence that we had seen. The challenge we have now is that ISIS is actually incredibly well funded. By some counts, they're sitting on about $2 billion of reserves. They just took $400 million of cash when they occupied Mosul. So even if we were to try to replicate just that portion again, where we simply tried to pay people to fight on our side instead of the other side's actually incredibly well financed. And that's one of the reasons, for instance, in Syria, ISIS has been so strong is that they simply pay more than any of the other militias and any of the other movements that are part of the opposition to Assad. And that's been one of their key ways of strengthening themselves. So there's absolutely some truth to that. And the myth out there that simply what happened was we sent a bunch of American soldiers and they solved all the problems is really one that's a detriment, because it's now coming back to harm us, and in the notion that all we have to do again is send American troops into harm's way, and that'll take care of the problem. That's absolutely not going to take care of the problem any more today than it did in 2007.
So part of what's spinning in my head, as you said all this, was, and this is a fact, this is something I didn't know. They got how much money when they took over Mosul?
Yeah, it's estimated to be about $400 million in cash. Obviously, there's an Iraqi currency, not U.S. dollars, but that they got from the central bank in Mosul. They've been looting banks kind of throughout their advance in northern Iraq. They actually have a number of money-making schemes. Kidnapping is one. It brings them actually tens of millions of dollars a year, kidnapping journalists in Syria, for example. They also operate some oil refineries in Syria, and believe it or not, they trade the oil that they're refining with the Assad government and with some Turkish energy brokers for cash as well. So they have a tremendous amount of financial reserves, and it makes them a formidable force.
Well, money talks, and when we come back after the break, we'll talk a little bit more about this and get to solutions with Stephen Miles of the Coalition of Win Without War. But I would also add that ISIS in Iraq has also been waging a surprisingly sophisticated media strategy, including yesterday tweeting out a Photoshop photograph of Michelle Obama, with the hashtag bring back our Humvee, because they took some American military Humvees. So these guys are well financed, they know what they're doing, and when we come back, we figure out what we as American citizens should be pushing for. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. We'll be right back. And we are back on the Zero Hour with Stephen Miles, who is the coalition coordinator for Win Without War. Stephen, thanks so much. We're talking about the situation in Iraq. But before we pivot in a moment to solutions, I just want to ask you to comment. I mentioned before we went to break their sophisticated social media campaign. And I think one of the things that people miss when they hear about events in Iraq or when they read the news, whatever, in this country is I think there's a stereotyping that because they're extremists, because they're fundamentalists, because they're so violent and so on, and they really are all of those things. I think that somehow they're stupid, they're easy to defeat, they're unsophisticated. I don't think any of those things are necessarily true. Would you agree with that?
I would. I mean, I think you're right to stress that these are not, these are not Boy Scouts. These are violent extremists who are doing some pretty despicable things. But you're absolutely right. They are sophisticated, and that does bring us actually to what we're supposed to do. Just over the last week, we saw two things that are clearly attempted provocations to try to entice a broader fight. So there was a series of executions that they undertook earlier in the week, and then a kind of media blitz they did around those, saying that they had killed 1,700 Shiite members of the Iraqi security forces. Now, they certainly performed some executions, and it's clear that they were on a large scale, but most accounts it wasn't 1,700. So you have to think, why would someone brag about that? Well, what they're trying to do is they're trying to provoke a sectarian backlash. They're trying to lure Maliki into making this a fight where it is a Shia versus Sunni fight. They can rally Sunnis to their side against the Shias, and then they want to bring us in, and they want to bring the Americans in on the side of the Shia and make this about Iran and America supporting the Maliki government, and make it one big fight. And so that's exactly why they do things like tweet out a picture of Michelle Obama and try to make this about aggression towards America. I mean, they would like nothing more than for us to get deeply involved in this fight in a way we were in the past decade. And then they can once again rally a number of folks who certainly don't want to be on any part of their kind of violent and murderous ways, but will be pulled to their side by their standing up and fighting the great state in America in their message. So I think we need to be careful about that. We need to understand the sophistication, and we need to think about what is in the U.S. interest. What can we do that will be good for the people of Iraq, and what, above all, can we do to first do no harm? And that has to be our guiding principle, is how do we not make this situation worse?
Well, and I think that brings up, it's a great point, and I think that, and the sort of Hippocratic principle of first do no harm, I think, or stop doing harm is a critically important point. And I guess, I've been, certainly in the beginning of this hour, very rough on the Republicans who started this war and so on. But you mentioned Maliki and sectarianism, and one of the things that I think is important for people to know is that I would argue, again, feel free to challenge me if you disagree, but I would argue that one of the greatest mistakes that Obama has made since coming into office has been putting too much resource on the side of the Maliki government, where Maliki himself has used his power in some appalling ways. I mean, I think Chelsea Manning had some revelations about that, but I think that we've also seen, just in terms of publicly available knowledge, that Maliki has been vindictive. He's not been inclusive in the way that a successful leader would be to avoid this kind of outcome. So if I were to chide Obama for one thing, and I'm sure I could find more than one in Iraq, but I would say his excessive backing of Maliki. Am I wrong on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important to recognize that the president, well, I think on the whole has had a very good policy. We did make a decision to stand by Maliki, and we because of our involvement at the time, the last time there were parliamentary elections, got deeply involved with kind of the business of Iraqis sorting out who was going to form the government and who was going to be involved. And in hindsight, backing Maliki over another faction clearly does not look like the right decision. It's probably one you can make an argument that we repeated in Afghanistan with Hamid Karzai as well, and it kind of is just a reminder that despite the best of intentions, and it is clear the president has some truly good intentions here that I think is a major difference than the previous administration, but despite the best of intentions, when you meddle in these countries, when you meddle in their internal politics, you can really have some horrible unintended consequences, and it should be by now a lesson that America has learned about unintended consequences.
Okay, well then, Stephen Miles, Coalition Coordinator for Win Without War, what should we be doing, and what should concerned citizens be demanding of their president and representatives that we do?
Well, so two things. The first is exactly what I said before. First, do no harm. I mean, there's a bucket of things that kind of feel good in that classic American John Wayne sense of we're going to do something. Airstrikes always sound good and simple. Helping the Iraqis put down quote-unquote terrorists sounds good and simple. But we really need to make sure and take a giant step back that we're not doing harm and really think, and in our opinion, those are options we should not be taking. When it comes to what we should be taking, there's kind of a litany of options. None of them are going to be sufficient by themselves, and the thing we have to do is break ourselves from this notion that there are easy or even good options. There aren't. There is no single solution. But part of the solution is going to be a diplomatic solution to what is now a major regional conflict. You can't talk about Iraq without talking about Syria, and you can't talk about Syria without talking about Iraq. You can't talk about either one without talking about Iran and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and the other regional players. What we need to do is go back and look and revisit something like the Dayton process in the Balkans, have a major rethinking and a major sorting out of how we're going to solve this problem diplomatically. And that's going to require some creative thinking, and it's going to require us to focus on that process and not focus on military solutions. We also need to deal with the humanitarian crisis. There are millions of refugees, both internally displaced and in other countries now in the region. The refugees systems for supporting them are woefully underfunded, and they're going to require a massive massive influx of cash to help support. And so we need to seriously look at that because it is a growing humanitarian crisis. And then ultimately, we're going to need to get people to stop fighting, and we're going to need to find a way to have a ceasefire. That's going to require some serious conversations with the various factions. It's going to require conversations with the parties who are supporting the various factions, and it's going to be a complicated, messy business. But that's that in a nutshell. And many, many, many other things that are going to have to be done by the Iraqis, by the Syrians, decisions they have to make for themselves about their future and the type of country they want to live in. That's the path. The path is clearly not American airstrikes. It's clearly not American special forces. And we need to be thinking a lot more about those other kinds of solutions and a whole lot less about whether we're sending a couple hundred military advisors or whether we're taking some drone strikes.
Okay, so two more questions for you. Number one, 275 troops going in, we're told, to protect our embassy personnel. Worrisome, not worrisome? That's question number one. And question number two, where does Syria fit into all of this?
So, let me start with Syria. Syria is inextricably linked. The border there is very porous. It's very, very desert. The combatants, by and large, are both in Syria, in both Syria and Iraq. And so, again, this is a regional problem that is going to require a regional solution. And it also brings up kind of the craziness of the concept of, last fall we were talking about bombing in Syria to support Assad, to support the rebels against Assad. In Iraq, we're now talking about bombing the same folks who are rebels in Syria to support the Iraqi government. So, we're talking about a very complex situation.
Right. We're talking about when Hillary Clinton says she disagreed with Obama and thought we ought to bomb Assad in support of the rebels of Syria, I thought she was talking about supporting the same people, a lot of the same people who were talking about attacking in Iraq. And I think you're saying that's true. And so last question, Stephen Miles, A Win Without War. A lot of people are very concerned that 275 troops, we're told they're defending embassy personnel, but in Vietnam we were told 40 advisors were going to train the South Vietnamese, and that didn't work out very well. So how concerned should we be?
There's actually two different things. There was early in the week. It was announced that there was 275 troops, mostly Marines, going a traditional embassy security role. That's probably fairly understandable given the circumstances. The U.S. Embassy in Baghdad is the largest embassy in the world. It's 5,000 personnel. Just the process of evacuating them, if need be, in an emergency is going to require some folks to help secure that and make sure it happens. But the thing that was announced yesterday is actually different. That's up to 300 special operations forces who will be advisors. Now, these are going to be folks who are going to be broken down into small teams of 10 to 20. They're going to be forward deployed in close coordination with the Iraqi government. And we're told they're going to be doing primarily intelligence missions, but there's still some confusion exactly about what they're going to be doing. But these are not guys there to guard the embassy. These are there to gain a deeper understanding of the conflict, help advise the Iraqis. But we should be concerned about this. This is not base security. These are 300 special operations soldiers. These are, Green Berets, Army Rangers, Navy SEALs. It's unclear the exact makeup, but these are guys who are going to be potentially near the front line. And we don't know what's going to happen. We have to see what's going to happen as this unfolds. But it's, from our perspective, a troubling development. We're going to have to watch it, and we need to make sure that this does not escalate. Because, as you said, we saw in Vietnam, unfortunately, how advisors can become troops very, very quickly, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen here.
Well, we'll have to end on that. We've seen this movie before. We didn't like how it ends. Let your representatives know you're concerned. Where can people find out more about Win Without War? We've got our website, www.winwithoutwar.org. You can check out all sorts of information there. And thanks for having me on the show, Richard. Thank you. And Stephen Miles, thank you for all the great work you guys are doing. We will be right back after this on the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. To close off our Iraq hour here, let's just hear a little bit of Megyn Kelly, Fox News host, interviewing Dick Cheney and his daughter Liz about their editorial blaming Iraq's problems on Barack Obama. What did Megyn Kelly have to say?
In your op-ed, you write as follows: rarely has a U.S. president been so wrong about so much at the expense of so many. But time and time again, history has proven that you got it wrong as well in Iraq, sir. You said there was no doubt Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. You said we would be greeted as liberators. You said the Iraq insurgency was in the last throes back in 2005. And you said that after our intervention, extremists would have to, quote, rethink their strategy of jihad. Now, with almost $1 trillion spent there, with 4,500 American lives lost there, what do you say to those who say you were so wrong about so much at the expense of so many?
This is Fox News. Imagine what an objective news organization would do. I got to give it up for Megyn Kelly. I have to say, she nailed it. And God bless her for it, because that's what needed to be said. But, you know, the reemergence of Dick Cheney, who apparently seems to be promoting his daughter for a political career, even though even voters who sympathize with their political views, apparently dislike her for easily understandable reasons. She can't get elected. He's trying to carry, you know, even in a society that's an oligarchy where power, like wealth, is passed on from one family to another nowadays, Liz Cheney can't get elected dog catcher. But I guess one of the problems that the reemergence of the Cheneys has highlighted for those of us who try to be good people, people of conscience, people who tolerate all political beliefs and all that sort of thing, and I include myself very much among them, is what do you say about human beings who are clearly and demonstrably and repeatedly evil? I'm talking about Dick Cheney. I'm talking about his chip off the old block daughter, Liz. I'm talking about the Project for a New American Century, some of whom I knew, by the way, some of whom I worked with, and they were very nice people, but the sum total effect of, as opposed to Dick Cheney, but the sum total effect of their impact on the world is dark. I mean, I would say some of the PNAC people, the Project for a New American Century people, are misguided. But these Cheney, what do you do? What do you say? I mean, I remember back when he was vice president, getting flippant myself, kind of Andy Borowitz style, and saying, I remember when they found a dead deer on the vice president's lawn, I said maybe it was part of the, you know, satanic ceremony gone wrong. You know, maybe this was when he was trying to hand over the evil eye amulet to Rudy Giuliani to anoint his successor in the underworld. But at which point my wife got very concerned and said, you know, these people can audit us and something, and not unreasonable fear on her part. But what do you say about people like Dick Cheney and Liz, his mini-me, writing, for example, see, this is how these people work. They talk about dog whistle language. This is how their editorial begins. As the terrorists of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS threatened Baghdad, thousands of slaughtered Iraqis. Okay, let's start with that word terrorists. Okay, that's supposed to be the word that makes every American sit up and salivate and say, here, have my civil liberties, murder anybody you want. But as we showed in our segment with Stephen Miles, Win Without War, the people that he's calling terrorists in Iraq are the people we're calling freedom fighters in Syria, and that he would have called freedom fighters himself. So, and terrorists is actually, it's a misuse of the word. When someone's fighting in an army in a civil war, they are technically not a terrorist. They are a combatant. These are violent, extreme people, but it's just a dog whistle word. Thousands of slaughtered Iraqis, as if that's ever been something that Dick Cheney cares about. He mocks Barack Obama for saying he was ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan as though wishing made it so. Well, okay, we can critique Obama, and I do. And also, I think he and a lot of his supporters took a lot of credit for ending the war in Iraq, when really he just couldn't negotiate a deal with Maliki that would allow him to stay and keep military presence there. But okay, look, he's certainly way better than Dick Cheney, and we're glad he's there. So watching the black-clad, this is Dick Cheney at his most lurid, watching the black armor-clad ISIS jihadists take territory once secured by American blood is final proof. Okay, it was never secured by American blood. The American blood was spilled and wasted by Dick Cheney. They are emboldened on the march. Iraq is at risk of falling to a radical Islamic terror group, and Mr. Obama is talking climate change. Ha, 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 ha. As if a president can't do two things at once, right? And, okay, what's the alternative to a radical Islamic terror group? Mr. Cheney's strategy was to give it to a pro-Iranian group instead, undemocratic pro-Iranian leadership. So, and then, we won't go through this whole thing, but, he goes golfing. Terrorists take control and Obama goes golfing, as if these guys never went golfing. He seems blithely unaware, or indifferent to the fact that a resurgent al-Qaeda, it's actually not al-Qaeda anymore, presents a clear and present danger to the United States of America. Okay, here we go again. They've expressed no interest in attacking us. Dick Cheney lied and said that Iraq attacked us on 9/11, which it didn't. Here we go again. Here come the drumbeats to war. So the question for you, our listeners, the question for me as an American, as every American citizen, is: are we going to stand up and fight the forces of evil, the forces of confusion, the forces of deception, the forces of war? Are we going to fight him, or are we going to go along? And I'm sorry, this is not a time for equivocation. I want to hear from Hillary Clinton how she's going to prevent a renewed war in Iraq. I want to hear from every single member of the United States Senate, Democratic and Republican, how are they going to prevent a war in Iraq? I do want President Obama to address this issue. Stephen Miles outlined a very sensible program of humanitarian aid, a new approach. I would suggest we need to bring people in, multinational forces to come in and negotiate. I think we have to say to our allies, the Saudis, who are funding a lot of this activity, we need to get them to sit down at a table with the Iranians, who are closely allied with some of the people fighting on the other side, and say, you guys need to work this out. Time is running out. And time is running out. So no more jokes, no more flippancy. It's time to move. It's time to end the war in Iraq once and for all. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WeAct Radio Network in Washington, D.C. and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
And we are back on The Zero Hour. With us now is Joan Entmacher, who is Vice President for Family Economic Security at the National Women's Law Center, where she leads a team to improve policies important to the economic security of low-income women and their families. That includes tax and budget, child care, child support, and unemployment insurance, as well as assistance and Social Security. And they've been putting out a lot of great reports, as they always do, sometimes with tragic stories to tell, but always very important. So, Joan Entmacher, National Women's Law Center. First of all, correct me if I mispronounce your last name. Entmacher, I'm guessing. And thank you so much for being on the program.
Thanks. I'm pleased to be here.
How'd I do on the name?
Perfect.
Thank you. Glad to hear it. With a name like mine, you sometimes get a little sensitive. And mine's completely phonetic, so I don't know what the problem is. But one of the things you wrote about recently, or rather I should say that your group studied recently, is, and I think this is a really important issue, I've tried to make the point on this program a number of times, that we always talk about private sector employment when the newspapers cover it and employment issues and so on. But we've been, at the meantime, cutting public sector jobs at an unprecedented rate. And I believe a recent study of your groups showed that this is disproportionately affecting women.
Yes, it definitely is. I mean, women are a majority of public sector employees, particularly at the local level. Think about teachers and public health workers. And those jobs were hit very heavily. Ironically, not during the recession as it's defined, but by government's failure to renew the Recovery Act, which had provided funding to states and localities so they didn't have to make cuts, and then that funding was ended, and state budgets were still in crisis, and they still haven't recovered. We are still down from where we were, and it's women who are bearing the brunt of those cuts.
And that would be because women are disproportionately in professions like, I'm guessing, like teaching and perhaps nursing and some other fields that might be
social work and
social work.
Right. And a lot of the administration of programs like unemployment insurance that are done at the state level. Women are responsible for administering those programs, and they've been cut. And it's a blow not only to women who hold those jobs, but also to the women who are served, to the women who depend on sending their children to public schools, to receiving Medicaid benefits that are largely administered by women, who go to public health clinics where nurses and other health paraprofessionals work. So it's a blow both to the families who rely on those services and the women who hold them.
Well, and that's a very important point. So let's, just to look at the numbers a little bit from the report that the Law Center did. The economy added 217,000 jobs in May. Women, which, by the way, it's important to reiterate that while that sounds good and is good, we would be needing to add significantly more in order to offset for increases in the working age population and other shifts. So there's no reason to be. We need a lot more overall growth on the jobs area than we're seeing right now. But the economy added 217,000 jobs in May, but for women it was 86,000, while men gained 131,000. And the women's job gains were disproportionately in low-wage sectors, leisure and hospitality and retail and so on. So number one, we're seeing men benefit disproportionately from the jobs that are being created. Number two, we're seeing women who do get jobs get low-paying jobs. And number three, as you just pointed out, as a result of these budget cuts, there is also a declining set of services available, for example, to women who would categorize as lower income or working poor. So if we summarize that, it sounds like whatever the intentions behind some of these policy decisions, they're turning out to be anti-woman in effect.
They definitely are. I mean, women are, and I mean, clearly the policies are hurting men as well. Women are a particular concern because even before this recession, they were more likely to be poor. They have lower incomes when they're working. The wage gap of 77 cents to the dollar hasn't moved in a decade. So I think one of the concerns is that women were vulnerable, and now things are getting even worse. But clearly the cuts in public funding has hurt men. We see it now with the inability to agree on replenishing the Highway Trust Fund. Those are a lot of construction jobs, fairly well-paying, probably would mostly go to men. And that would be important because although construction jobs have started to come back, there are still a lot of men who are looking for work, and Congress can't get that done either. So
well, really you guys also did a study.
Widespread.
Yeah, you guys also did a piece on construction jobs and the fact that those are disproportionately male and that women were working. Yeah, that's right. Understatement, right?
Yes, I'll say so. 3% of construction jobs are held by women. That's where we were 30, 40 years ago.
Right, and the women who do take those jobs are subject to sometimes intense sexual harassment. Yeah. So, I guess the question is, two things, I guess, but one of them is, as we encourage, obviously we do want to repair our broken infrastructure and so on, and we do need construction jobs. Is there a policy answer that would say, for example, there has to be a set-aside for women's jobs, as well as strict enforcement of protection against sexual harassment?
I think set aside or goals that are really aggressively looked at, because one of the reasons that the sexual harassment is so rife is that there are so very few women. I mean, something the military discovered when women entered the military, which was another institution with not very welcoming attitudes at the beginning, but that it was key to have a significant number of women come in to provide some support, and obviously for the leadership of an organization to say this is not going to be tolerated, and employers and managers on the job sites need to be clear about their responsibilities. I mean, the interesting thing is there are, and what our report showed is that there are women with the training and skills to do this work and the interest in doing it. It's not just that, women aren't interested. They are, but they get driven out by really appalling levels of harassment and abuse.
And it is horrifying. And I guess in the slightly less than a minute we have left, I would summarize by saying, okay, so we need to do something aggressive about getting women in construction jobs and protecting them, and perhaps to stop demonizing or minimizing the vital jobs of teachers and other people who work in the public sector, and going back to respecting the fact that a public sector job is a good job that does good work. Would you, in 30 seconds, you basically agree with that?
Totally. I mean, those are the jobs: educating our children, providing health care for everyone, providing parks and recreation for people who don't have the money to fly off to distant places, but have to use our public transit and use our public parks and use our public schools. That's the vast majority of us, and that's what our public employees do.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. Thanks so much for your terrific work at the National Women's Law Center. We'll keep following, and we'll keep asking you for guidance on this. Joan Entmacher, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, RJ.
You bet. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we will be right back after this. This is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and with us now is Catherine McFate. Catherine McFate is the president and CEO of the Center for Effective Government, which is a nonpartisan policy and advocacy organization whose mission is to build an open, accountable government that invests in the common good and advances the priorities of an active, informed citizenry. And it is about that we are going to speak today. Catherine, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for asking me.
Now, my understanding is that you and your organization are involved with something called Witness Wednesday. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So tell us about it.
Okay. Well, do you want me to tell you about how we got involved?
No, just tell us what Witness Wednesday is.
It's actually got a subtitle, is Stories of the Unemployed. So what we're doing is every Wednesday we go up to the Hill and we get members of Congress and members from the faith community and labor and other nonprofit and advocacy groups to read the stories of unemployed people. There are now over 3.1 million people who have been unemployed for at least 6 months and are getting absolutely no assistance. And the stories that they're telling us about how that's affected their lives and what's happening to them are really quite compelling and painful to listen to. We believe that this shouldn't be a partisan issue. This should just be an issue of taking care of each other. This is an American issue. We've never before had this level of long-term unemployment and without the federal government stepping in and providing assistance. But we cut it off. They cut it off at the end of 2013, and there are millions of families who are suffering as a result of that, and we think it's just unconscionable that we're not taking action.
Well, I worry. I spend a lot of time thinking about the long-term unemployed, just because, for one thing, it's such a human tragedy, and
Absolutely.
I write about I wrote about those. I was just saying, just a year ago, I wrote a piece called "The Forgotten Americans," about them, because it seems that everybody's forgotten them. Mm-hmm. Since then, if you listen to the government reports, people will say there has been something like a 900,000 plus reduction in the number of long-term unemployed, which would still leave, I don't have the figures in front of me, about 3.34 million long-term unemployed or somewhere in that area. And but we don't know how much of that reduction is due to people finding jobs and how much is due to them becoming discouraged workers and no longer
Correct.
looking. And I suspect a lot of it is the latter, don't you think?
Yes, because we have 5 to 6 million people who are in that category now. So we have a lot of people who have just feel like they've given up and stopped looking, so they're not counted as unemployed, but they're not in the labor force, and they don't. So they're not looking for work, and they still don't have jobs. So we have this gap, and we don't know what's happened to those folks.
And one of the reasons why I think it's so important what you're doing is that if you're a human being with any empathy at all, and you can imagine what it'd be like to be a working, productive member of society, paying your bills, feeding your kids, doing whatever it is you do in your life, and then all of a sudden you're not. And basically the message that society is sending to you by its policies and its behavior is, and you're never going to again.
Or we just don't have any faith that you're worth investing in to continue to try to... I mean, people forget that the reason we have unemployment insurance is so that it provides people a platform so that when they're looking for work, they can still pay their rent, they can keep their utilities on, they can pay for their phone, they can put gas in their car so they can go for those job interviews. And when you take away all that, any kind of cash assistance to be able to do that, then you're really putting people in this position of incredible stress where they're wondering where they're going to get the money to take care of their families and to keep the lights on while they're trying to find a new job. You can imagine how stressful it is just to be unemployed, but to be unemployed without any kind of support while you're looking for that next job is just horrible for folks. And what we saw, we started collecting stories from folks who responded to a blog that we wrote about this issue in February. We now have 2,300 stories up on our website because people started responding and they seemed to want to talk about what was going on with them. And over those months, you could see this in February, March, when it was only 2 months of not having unemployment insurance assistance. People were saying, I'm really behind on my utility bills, and I'm charging up my credit cards, and it's really tough, and I'm really looking hard, but I send out resumes every day, and nothing comes back. Well, now 6 months, the stories are just getting so much more desperate, and people are saying, I was foreclosed on, I was evicted, I finally got a job interview, but I didn't have gas money to go to that job interview. You can imagine that people seem to be, their phones are being cut off, their utilities are cut off. And there was a moment in April when the Senate actually did pass an extension of federal unemployment benefits that was going to be retroactive. So it went back and they were going to give people those back benefits. And the folks who were responding to our website were like thrilled. They were saying, oh, this is great. I'm going to finally be able to pay back my utilities and get back on track, with that retroactive pay, so that dig ourselves out of the hole, pay down some of the credit cards, and then hopefully when I get another job, I'll be able to move forward. And now they're just so upset and so desperate. And these are folks we've got all these people who are like in their 40s and 50s and say they've worked for 30 years, they've never been unemployed before, and they've just pulled out all the resources they can. They've used their savings. They've used any retirement income, and they're really desperate. And it's just unconscionable that they have fallen off the radar.
We're talking with Catherine McFate of the Center for Effective Government about Witness Wednesday. So Witness Wednesday, in effect, is, as I understand it, an attempt to trigger something in the consciences of members of Congress who are not acting on this by humanizing the tragedy that is deepened with every day that unemployment insurance extensions are not passed for these long-term unemployed.
That's right. If you listen to the stories, or if you go, you can go on we have a witnesswednesday.org website. You can go on and you can look at the stories. You can look at videotape of people reading the stories. When you hear this, it's hard to say those are people not like us. Those are people we don't know, because they sound like your friends and neighbors and people that you do know. And that's what we're trying to remind people, that these are folks who are just unfortunate and either live in a tough labor market or are just, for a variety of reasons, having a hard time getting back into the labor market. And it could be us. I kind of wonder if that's not part of the reason that people kind of look away and don't want to hear about it, because there's a fear that it could be them. And it's, you would think that
sometimes it seems, like people feel that kind of thing is contagious.
Yeah.
And that if I think about it too much, it could be me next time. I
Yeah.
could catch it.
Yeah. And so it's almost like, shield my eyes, I don't want to see that. That could affect somebody I know.
Well, we do want to see it, and unfortunately we're running to the end of our time, but where can people go to learn about Witness Wednesday?
www.witnesswednesdays.org. And we're live streaming the events every week, so if people want to, they can go on that website. We've got tapes from the past two. The one we're doing this coming week is on veterans. There's an enormous, hundreds of thousands of veterans who are unemployed. And we think the week before the 4th of July, it might be time to stop and listen to their stories and look in your heart and see if you don't think that they deserve our help as a country.
It's a perfect time. And with that, we're going to leave it. Thank you so much for your work on Witness Wednesdays. Catherine McFate, President and CEO of the Center for Effective Government, and thanks for joining us.
And thanks for caring. Okay.
Bye. We do care.
I know you
do. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we are back on The Zero Hour. And I'd like to talk to you for a minute, as we often do, about the Silicon Valley, about the bro culture and the grandiosity of the billionaires who run and profit off the businesses there. There's a lot of discussion in the Silicon Valley nowadays about whether we're in the middle of another technology bubble. I would argue we are. These services and technologies are wildly overpriced. I think they're going to collapse again, but it doesn't matter for the moment if I'm right or wrong. What matters more than anything else is the distortionary effect of the enormous amounts of money floating around the Silicon Valley and what it's doing to our culture as a whole. Now, that culture got a little bit of a shock this week when a Harvard professor named Jill Lepore, Lepore, wrote a piece for The New Yorker challenging one of their most sacred tenets and beliefs and dogmas in the Silicon Valley, which is that it's cool to, quote unquote, disrupt things. They're all about disrupting. They want to disrupt technology. They think they're disrupting the way of that everybody else does business, and they idolize Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook for saying, move fast and break things. Well, a 3-year-old moves fast and breaks things, so why is that inherently great? Well, it's great because there is a guru of management named Clayton Christensen, who's a big believer in the power of disruption, how that creates innovation and change. And Jill Lepore, who is a historian, wrote a piece saying that much of Clayton Christensen's work is erroneous, that he cherry picks his case studies in order to support his thesis that disruption is awesome and that technology is inherently transformative. Now, I read her piece. It's a very balanced piece. She says that, sometimes you need to change and disrupt the way of doing things in an organization or a kind of business. Sometimes you don't. I mean, that seems reasonable to me. She says that sometimes Clayton Christensen is right. Sometimes he's wrong. Seems reasonable to me. She says sometimes technology does great things. Other times it's not a solution to a problem. Seems reasonable to me. Doesn't seem so reasonable to the guys in the Silicon Valley. The bro culture is very, very, very upset. And that includes a guy we've complimented on this show in the past, Mark Andreessen, who is a venture capitalist, a very wealthy and successful guy. We liked it when he took on, he was the only one besides ourselves who found out what was really behind billionaire Tom Perkins's rant against Occupy and the San Francisco Chronicle and everything else, which is that the San Francisco Chronicle dared to criticize his ex-wife's hedges. And only Andreessen and ourselves were on top of that. We gave him props for that because I think he even beat us by a couple hours in finding that out. So got nothing against Mark except here he got very upset and he tweeted out things like, what does Jill Lepore, PhD in American Studies, think about quantum entanglement? Meaning, in an ironic, I suppose, sort of way, that because she has a PhD in history or American Studies, she's not qualified. It would be like her talking about particle physics, nuclear physics, to talk about the awesome things we do here in the Silicon Valley. Well, guess what, Silicon Valley bros? What you do is not quantum entanglement. It's not particle physics, buddies. It's not particle physics. It's just simple business, and you guys are grandiose about it. Uber transformative. Uber is a taxi cab calling system for people who run their own personal taxi cab services. It's a switchboard. There's nothing innovative about it. The sharing economy, we had the sharing economy 40 years ago. It was called the Weekender, where people could run classified ads and it was thrown in with your newspaper. You didn't see the guys who published the Weekender so that somebody could buy a new hedge trimmer or sell their used lawnmower. You didn't see cover stories on Wired magazine about how this paper classified ad thing is disrupting and it's transformative, because you didn't have billions of dollars flying around and that wasn't making people grandiose. Okay, so what does Jill Lepore know about quantum entanglement? Probably about as much as the guys who did Uber. What does Jill Lepore know about Uber? As much as you and I know about the classified ads that used to be used to get bundled with your Sunday newspaper. So Ro Khanna, the guy who was creamed. We had Yasha Levine on talking about his campaign, was creamed, but still is going to be a finalist for the congressional seat in the Silicon Valley. He ran, with this whole, I'm part of this culture and we're going to disrupt politics. Well, you know what? Disruption is sometimes good. It's sometimes bad. Sharing economy, again, Airbnb, it's high-tech classified ads. It's a high-tech version of the bulletin boards where people used to sell things at the co-op or in the basement of a church or a synagogue. It ain't nothing fancy except it's newer technology. And by the way, that technology was invented by the U.S. government. Now, one other thing, and this really, really made me laugh. Okay, the latest big buzzy startup in the tech community now is a technology called Yo, Y-O, Yo. And what Yo does is it allows you to send the word Yo to somebody else who belongs to the network. That's it. It's an app for your phone that allows you to say Yo. That's it. And yet it got $1 million in startup research. Well, I guess I would say if I was working in this economy where every dumb idea is treated as a second calling, as the second coming, I'd probably throw $1 million at Yo myself. But here's the thing. It's just a technology. It's a silly little gimmick. And yet we actually had somebody quoted in the Financial Times saying of Yo, it's a whole new form of communication. It is? Really? Tell it to Ali G, who was saying, 20 years ago on television. It's a whole new form of communication. This is how grandiose these guys have gotten. Well, guess what? Yo is not a whole new form of communication. And by the way, there's a huge security problem with it now. So people are saying not to use it. Disruption. If it ain't broke, don't disrupt it. That's the principle here. So there are two principles, I guess I would say. One is too much money makes you stupid. We're seeing that in the Silicon Valley. Or it attracts stupid people and the thinking that goes along with it. Yes, once in a while somebody makes a lot of money with a stupid idea. It's still a stupid idea. Two, if it ain't broke, don't disrupt it. That includes music. That includes people's professions, including taxi cab driver. That includes government. That includes society. Sometimes disruption is the right thing to do. Sometimes it's not. So why don't we design apps that build and improve rather than those that disrupt just for the sake of disruption. Why? Because that would take brains. You'd need brains. We need more real thinking in the Silicon Valley. And beyond that, all I have to say to the bros there is, yo. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. With us now is Sam Riddle. He's returning to The Zero Hour for his second appearance here. We're glad to have him. He is an honorably discharged Vietnam-era veteran. He earned a BA after dropping out of high school. Sam Riddle dropped out of high school to enlist in the United States Army. Then he earned a BA degree from Michigan State University and went on to receive his law degree from the University of Michigan Law School. He has also many years, decades of management and experience in political and media consulting, has an emphasis on crisis management, and right now with what's going on in the world, that's a good talent to have. Sam, are you with us?
Good afternoon. How are you doing, RJ?
Well, I'm doing better for hearing you, my friend. Okay. It's good to have you back on the program.
Great to be on.
And listen, yeah, good. Glad to have you. Listen, I haven't been to Detroit in too long, and I am coming next month, but, here's the deal. I'm trying to sort out from a distance. You wrote an awesome piece about it, which we'll get to in a second, but I am trying to sort out from a distance what's going on over there because it used to be, used to live there. But I mean, I'm wondering, why is it that, what's the water situation there? I mean, we've got a situation where I guess your city emergency manager, unelected ruler of the city, has taken it upon himself to privatize part of the water system there, and they're turning people's water off, but not the corporations, just people. What's the deal?
In a nutshell, what's occurring, RJ, is that we have thousands of Detroiters whose water is being turned off because they can't afford to pay the water bills. The irony of that is that Detroit, as you know, is in the center of the Great Lakes. And the Great Lakes, I don't have to tell you, but most of the water on the planet, fresh water, is right in the Great Lakes. I mean, they're the primary source of fresh water worldwide, save the polar caps themselves. Yet here in Detroit, where 60% of the 60% of the children live in poverty, the water is being turned off. Now, the article you're referring to, I did write an article concerning UN Resolution 64/292, in which the United Nations General Assembly explicitly recognized the human right to water and sanitation and acknowledged that clean drinking water and sanitation are essential to the realization of all human rights. That isn't Sam speaking. That's a United Nations resolution. Yet in this nation, America, the water is being turned off every week to at least 4,000 Detroiters, most of whom are people of color, African Americans. And we feel that's inhumane, a lot of us, and I am the political director, Michigan, of the National Action Network, and shortly we'll be appealing to some members of Congress to take this issue before the United Nations.
Right, and that's the piece that I think is brilliant, and I support you for that. And this is really about, and it's a great point, of course, about the Great Lakes. It's remember the ancient mariner, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. But in this case, it's about money. It's about, as I understand it, but correct me, Sam, if I'm wrong. It's about the fact that that's being privatized, the right to collect the water. Is that right?
Well, there's an attempt to do that. That hasn't been done yet, but believe me, it's about the next step. Just today, the governor of Michigan, the democracy-destroying, union-busting Governor Snyder, who now has set his eyes on the national Republican ticket, just today, he and his Detroit City Council, his mayor, his Negro proxy emergency manager, or they signed into agreement this grand bargain. Basically, what's occurring is that as we, America, inflict drone democracy the world over, democracy has been eradicated thoroughly in Detroit. Our city council cannot make any decisions. Our mayor cannot make any decisions. All the decisions are made by an emergency manager, the Negro emergency manager proxy of this Governor Snyder. And, as one who served 4 years in the military and honorably discharged during the Vietnam War era, it galls me in particular because they have our guys and women are fighting and dying world over in the name of democracy, and the doors to democracy have been slammed shut in Detroit where dollars are trumping democracy. There's something wrong with that picture.
Well, there sure is. And I guess my question for you, too, right around now, just a recent article says that not only are we having all these people have their water shut off, but the rates are going up. 8.7% increase.
But that Detroit City Council, which is really the governor's city council now, they just voted to raise the water rates 8%. We already have a population of Detroit, again, where 60% of the children live in poverty, which can't afford the current water rates. What are they going to do with the new increase? I mean, this is sheer madness.
And yet they're not, I'm trying to remember who it was, but I know there were some big corporations there who were not paying their water bills, and nobody was shutting their water off.
No, as a matter of fact, you can go down the line. You could look at, I think, Ford Field, the Elitches. There were a number of big corporations which simply are not paying water bills. And yet the water continues to flow for them. But, the governor and the emergency manager seemed to take great glee at saying, pay up or we cut it off, the water. I mean, the article that I wrote for the Michigan Citizen, the title of it was UN, Turn On Detroit Water. And unless we expose to the world what is occurring, I believe it will only get worse. I mean, we have two Detroits right now going. We see this throughout urban America, but the gentrification process, that is, the right peopling of Detroit, is taking place right now. And I've got to tell you, some of the most inhumane acts in this nation and the world are taking place in Detroit right now.
See, here's the way I see it. And you tell me if I'm wrong, if you think I'm wrong, but here's how I look at it. I see Detroit as the kind of test laboratory for the society they want to build, the cities of the future that they want. And I think their attitude is, well, because the budget problems are a little more extreme in New York, the hedge funds, raked through the pension funds and so on more, the white flight was greater, all the other manipulations of the economy, because they can make it sound a little more extreme. They're kind of using the people of Detroit as experimental subjects. If we get away with this here, we can do it everywhere. We can take away their democratic rights through emergency manager laws everywhere in the country. We can shut off their water. We can sell off the city property. We can cut their pensions, on and on and on. And so I kind of see one of the reasons why I think fighting for Detroit is important for the whole country is just because it's right. Number two, I think fighting for Detroit is important because I think first Detroit, they came for Detroit and I said nothing. Then they're going to come for Chicago. Then they're going to come for Washington. Then they're going to come for Los Angeles, and on and on and on.
Yeah, Philadelphia, Baltimore, the list gets South Central, Los Angeles. I mean, the list gets very long, and the reason is because unlike decades, a generation ago, when we had a labor-intensive society fueling the automobile industry, that's not required in the high-tech age of today. The labor that was based here in Detroit is no longer needed. So you've got a whole layers of human beings that are expendable who have probably the most piss-poor educational system, which is also being run by the state, and which is also a colossal failure. You look at the test scores, you look at some of the discipline problems. I mean, it's just unreal what is occurring in Detroit. And it's inhumane at its base. But that's the very reason Governor Snyder of Michigan can say and try to get a place on the National Republican ticket by saying, look, We control them. We put them in their place. And Michigan, I can do the same across the country. And he will receive a lot of support. I mean, the things that are occurring here, and some people might take offense at this, but it's the right people, Detroit. It almost takes on a Nazi-like atmosphere here in terms of the impact on people of color and African Americans and poor people in particular.
Well, and I think that, you got to see it to believe it. That's the other part of it, is that I think people who they're isolated from it, they're in other parts of the country, they're in suburban areas or whatever, they don't see the extremity of the poverty, the depth of the problem, and they don't see again, I keep coming back to my mind gets, I try to wrap my mind around the idea that, the average water bill in Detroit is what, $65, $75 a month, that somehow they're turning people's water off for that, but you've got all these large corporate interests. They're not turning their water off when they don't pay. Well, one of those people paying up would be like 30,000 ordinary people.
The other thing is this. Detroit is the world headquarters of General Motors, which receives more welfare, more corporate welfare almost than anyone else has ever seen in this nation. I mean, General Motors got a multi-billion-dollar bailout. They still owe $10 billion of that, and yet they're walking around with their heads held high. But that was on the backs of the American people. The General Motors, Chrysler, received the big bailouts, the too big to fail banks, which are directly responsible in many ways for the blight infestation of Detroit with those predatory loans that they made. I mean,
there is no question about it. Unfortunately, we're going to have to
on and on a rant, but I mean, you're right. The silence.
Well, we can't rant, Sam, because we're out of time. But it's always, as always, great to have you on the show. And listen, keep up the good work, keep up the good fight, and Detroit's not going down that easy, right?
Okay, RJ, and keep informing people. Love you, man. Take it easy.
Love you too. Take care. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we will be right back after this with The Zero Hour.
This is The Zero Hour with RJ Eskow, produced by the WeAct Radio Network in Washington, D.C., and broadcast across the nation. Visit us online at thisisthezerohour.com or at youtube.com/thezerohour. Ladies and gentlemen, RJ Eskow.
And we are back on The Zero Hour. Before we go into another great hour of guests and conversation, a few thoughts about privacy, human rights, and technology. An interesting thing happened a little more than a week ago when the Los Angeles Kings won the Stanley Cup. A drone, and I think they're still trying to figure out the identity of the drone. A drone was hovering over the crowd that was celebrating outside the rink after the victory, and I think we have audio of that, don't we?
They're trying to hit the drone out of the sky.
So the people were saying they're trying to hit the drone out of the sky, and the video, it's on YouTube, the video shows people throwing things at it. Let's listen to a little more.
We got the drone! We got the drone! We got the drone!
We got the drone! We got the drone! So basically summarizing what happened, there's one point where people are saying they're throwing all sorts of things at this drone that's hovering maybe 30 feet above them, and someone says, throw a shoe at it, throw a shoe at it. These are hockey fans, right? They're partying, they're celebrating. Somebody throws a shoe and misses. Then somebody throws a T-shirt. And how they didn't even ball it up. I don't know how the T-shirt got that high, but it did. And it went into the propellers of the drone, and the drone crashed. And then next thing you know, they're standing around it. And that's what the second video shows. We got the drone. We got the drone. We got the drone. Now, these are not civil liberties activists. These are not Rand Paul libertarians or freedom-fighting lefties like the people who listen to the Zero Hour. These are just people coming out of a hockey game killing a drone. Now, let's think about that for a second. What are the lessons we can learn from this? And then they're thrilled when they kill the drone. Why did this happen? It happened because of the old American expression I heard a lot when I was a kid growing up in Utica. And the expression is, who you looking at? Who do you think you're looking at? Well, people realize that a drone is looking at them. And you know what? People don't like that. They don't like it at all. Let me see here if I can find an article. Basically, the other thing that happened was that there was a 17-year-old girl who beat up a guy. She actually did beat up a guy for running his drone down a beach. Let me see if I can find this story right here. Give me a second. Yeah, no, she wasn't. He was 17. Woman attacked 17-year-old for flying drone over beach. A Westbrook woman in Madison, Connecticut, faces third-degree assault and breach of peace charges after police say she attacked a 17-year-old who was flying a drone over the beach at Hammonasset, I can't pronounce it, Hammonasset Beach State Park in Madison. Andrea Mears, 23, was charged after beating the guy up. Now, she initially claimed that he assaulted her, but he filmed her on his iPhone, too. So she was charged with assault. But you know what? She's gotten a lot of public sympathy for people who don't like hanging out on the beach and then there's a drone flying over them. So you got that incident. You got the Los Angeles Kings incident. Now, related story, more than 400 military drones have fallen from the sky, according to a year-long Washington Post investigation, in major accidents. Since the outbreak of the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, military drones have malfunctioned in myriad ways. This is the Washington Post, plummeting from the sky because of mechanical breakdowns, human error, weather, and other reasons. That means a lot of people have crashed drones out there and are looking to replicate them. It also brings up another question. If they don't like drones in Los Angeles or Madison, Connecticut, how do you think they feel about them in Pakistan and Yemen? So if you're looking to expand what is called the soft power of the United States through diplomacy, through friendship, through alliances, if you're looking to that method of reducing conflict, ending war, and protecting our national security, you really think our drone policy internationally is a smart idea? Gosh, I don't think so. Now, in Southeast Portland, there's a debate because the Neighborhood Watch program wants to buy a drone to spy on people coming through their neighborhoods. Air Force has begun its research into the next generation of drones. So clearly, we're all about this right now. And there is a new form of riot control drone that can actually pepper spray people. So it can not only spy on them, but it can prevent them from gathering, conceivably even peacefully. So what do you think about that? Now, but all is not lost. Kickstarter project plans to patrol the skies with anti-drone technology. So these people are trying to raise money on Kickstarter to crowdfund a personal drone detection system. It consists of 3 boxes that together form a mesh grid network or detection grid that would warn users about domestic drones with sensors that through Wi-Fi would trigger an alarm or send messages to your phone. So at least you know when you're being spied on by drones. But that still gets to the fact that we're spending more money for a new generation of drones. Every police department is getting them. They're expanding into the riot control and crowd control, human control business. And by the way, Amazon, which bragged that it was going to use drones to deliver its products, is now hiring lobbyists to make sure it's able to do that. How long do you think those Amazon drones are going to last over neighborhoods like the ones in Detroit, like the one I grew up in, like the one, because you know what, the neighborhood I grew up in, we had a lot of hockey fans. We didn't like people invading our privacy. How do you think, as our society becomes more and more fragmented between the 1% and the 0.1% and the rest of us, how do you think the struggling working people of America, the long-term unemployed, the underpaid, are going to feel about wealthy people's drones and law enforcement drones flying over them. I got one word for the drone technologists of the world. Who you looking at? I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour, and we're going to do something a little different now. We've been talking about technology in Iraq, and I wanted to have the next guest on for weeks now since I read his book about the man who is best known as the lead singer for U2, Bono. Harry Browne, the author, is a Dublin-based activist and journalist who writes for the Irish Times, Sunday Times, Irish Daily Mail, Evening Herald, and Sunday Tribune. He is the author of Hammered by the Irish, How the Pit Stop Plowshares Disabled a U.S. Warplane with Ireland's Blessing. His new book is The Front Man, Bono, and then in parentheses, In the Name of Power, close paren. And this book explores Bono's relationship with the global power structure in terms of his very public and very self-proclaimed philanthropy. So Harry Browne, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, you're joining us from Belfast, I understand.
I am. I'm in Belfast at a conference about the Clash, funny enough, talking about that particular relationship between music and politics as it played out in the late 70s and early 80s. And it's very much the relationship that U2 and Bono arose from. So it's quite appropriate.
One wonders what might happen had Joe Strummer lived, lead singer for the Clash, and debated Bono.
That's a great thought. I mean, to a great extent, I mean, Joe lived for a good long time and was around long enough to see Bono, as I would see it, sort of decline into being a kind of handmaiden of the neoliberal elite. I don't know that Joe ever had anything to say about it, but I do think that they represent interesting poles. At the same time, I don't hold up Joe Strummer or anybody else as an ideal to which Bono has somehow failed. It's not the idea of the book. I mean, the idea, I guess, of the book is to just present some facts about those relationships and to encourage people to, I hope, maybe think a little bit differently about how a cultural figure like Bono relates to structures of political and economic power.
Right, and let's talk about that. I didn't mean to hold the Clash up as an ideal either. I mean, the only band that matters is a debatable slogan and so on. But, okay, so basically, tell us a little bit about the angle of your book, rather than me doing it. I know you say, among other things, the publicity material for your book says Bono has become an unwitting symbol for a complacent, wealthy Western elite. So tell us a little bit about why you think that.
Well, I guess what I attempt to do in the book is to lay out in terms of Ireland, in terms of Africa, and then in terms of kind of relationships to kind of global institutions, the way in which Bono, I think, based on a set of largely good intentions, found himself drawn into first to the kind of the office of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of Exchequer in Britain, drawn into the White House and the halls of power in Washington, drawn into the structure of foundations and philanthropic organizations and corporations in both sides of the Atlantic, and indeed in Africa, and that in effect he went from being a sort of a symbol of a certain kind of resistance to the idea that the poor are always with us, to becoming a symbol of the rich and their good intentions towards the poor. It seems to me that if there's one moment that sort of captures that, it's the Make Poverty History campaign in 2005, when most of the people who were experts in global poverty, and many, particularly African experts in global poverty, thought that the G8 that year that in Scotland had basically sold out the poor again. Bono stood beside Tony Blair and George Bush. He got them to sign a declaration, and he said, "Look, it's done now. We're well on our way to conquering poverty." And that story that he tells, that he and Bill Gates and now Barack Obama, then it was Tony Blair and George Bush, that they have the interests of the poor at heart, and that really the rest of us can wait and watch as they bring the best ideas and the best expertise into play to eradicate poverty. That, it seems to me, is the reality of what Bono has become, and it's the danger of what he's become.
Well, I'll tell you, there is an incident, a quote kept coming to mind reading your book, which is when I was very young but still interested in politics, I saw Leroy Jones, as he was then known,
Sure.
interviewed on a talk show, and somebody asked him what he thought about folk music, white protest music, and so on. And he said, I think those folk singers are the sensitive antennae of white racism." And what kept coming to my mind reading your book was that Bono and maybe one or two other celebrities like him, but really is kind of this, is he the sensitive antennae of a global economic elite where you can participate in it but feel wonderful about yourself at the same time as to sort of diffuse any guilt? Is he kind of an inoculation against guilt? Is that his role?
I think that's a wonderful insight. And Amiri Baraka is a New Jersey guy like myself, so or was indeed. We lost him recently, and I think that's a great idea. And it's a great concept that Bono provides a kind of a service to power. I guess that's that phrase of service to power that Noam Chomsky uses all the time. I think Bono is in that business, not in the same way as the intellectuals that Chomsky is usually denouncing, but something similar. And his service is exactly as you say. It's to kind of warn them of their limits, but it's largely in relation to their public image to burnish them. And the funny thing is that Bono's capacity to create that sort of warm glow around those figures and to dress them in the garb of humanitarianism is based on really genuine positive qualities that he possesses as an artist, and I think one of the, compared to say a George Clooney or an Angelina Jolie, I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of Bono, that his credibility is first and foremost artistic credibility. I mean, people might argue about whether he still possesses it, but certainly the Bono of the 80s, early 90s had it, and it was an artistic and moral credibility that he was able to take from the realm of cultural production and move it into the realm of philanthropy. And I think it's one of the reasons why I think he's an important figure to try to debunk, in as much as the book is an attempt to debunk one character. I hope it's a book about a system of thinking and a system of power, but insofar as it's about him, it's in order to identify the way that power uses figures like this, figures that we love because we've been listening to them, and thinking we know them, thinking that they share our views of the world certainly in many of our cases since we were kids.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things I liked about your book, we're talking with Harry Brown, author of The Front Man, about Bono. One of the things I liked about your book is not mean-spirited. It's not, you're not trashing the guy, and you recognize his genuine artistic achievements and so on, which I think a lot of us feel very warmly about. But, the other personality that kept coming to mind reading the book was Bill Clinton. Interestingly enough, that somehow in my mind, Clinton serves a similar role of making everybody feel good about the system as it exists. I went to one of the Clinton Global Initiative meetings, and I remember saying to a friend, if I see one more feel-good video of happy African children dancing in the water from a well sponsored by a corporation when they wouldn't need the well if that corporation and others like it didn't exist, I'll go crazy, and I think there's an element of these charismatic personalities with genuine gifts who serve, again, as you say, they make power itself feel better about itself, but I think they also pacify the public to a certain extent. Well, good things are being done, there's Bono with so-and-so, and there's... And so I see your book, Harry Brown, is important also because it challenges that. And I guess, what would the ideal reader of The Front Man come away thinking?
Well, that's a great question, and I appreciate your point about Bill Clinton very much. I think you're right, and to some extent, I think that in the book, Bono's meeting with Clinton is a sort of a fateful moment in his development. These two great charismatic characters coming together, and I think that my ideal reader of The Front Man is somebody who has got sort of decent political instincts and thinks that Bono partly represents them. And I guess what I'm trying to do is to lay out the history and to lay out some sense of the structure so that they can understand that maybe he doesn't. If they read the book and they come to the conclusion that maybe Bono's doing the right thing after all, sure, I can't argue with them. That's fine. They'll at least have done that on the basis of probably learning some new facts about him. But I hope that they read the book and come out thinking, well, we can't leave it to Bono and Bill Clinton. We have to do this ourselves. And, we being, however you want to construct it, the 99%, the people of Africa. One of the interesting phenomena I've had recently is that, the book was covered on the BBC World Service. Bono's public relations people weren't happy about that at all because negative talk about Bono is pretty unusual in Africa. And I do think, in the public sphere, if you like, on the likes of the BBC World Service, which goes out to millions of people in Africa. So I think it's really important that we come to understand these figures, these Clintons, these Bonos, these Geldofs, these Clooneys, and understand them not only in terms of their own personal virtue, which in many cases is great, but I'd understand them in terms of larger structures which continue to, to create great amounts of immiseration and poverty around the world.
I couldn't agree more, and that's why one of the reasons why I really wanted to talk to you about the book. Your other book sounds fascinating too. I hope we'll get a chance to talk about that as well. But again, it goes back to, as you say, organizing for ourselves, self-organization, activism, and staying away from the anesthetic power of celebrity do-gooderism. And I think you've contributed to that in a wonderful way. So good luck. I'd love to hear about the Clash conference as well. But for now, we'll have to leave it there. Harry Browne, author of The Frontman, Bono in the Name of Power. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. With us now is Julia Kahn, an organizer and staff writer with Labor Notes. Julia wrote a great piece about the taxi action in London over Uber. I was just ranting about Uber earlier in the program. And that, of course, is the technology which allows you, it's an app which allows you, I called it, I believe, nothing more than a fancy switchboard, but it is an app which allows you to call up a person who is willing to give rides, and they will come instead of a taxi and pick you up for, at least in this country, more than it costs to catch a cab, but certainly convenient. And Julia wrote about the backlash in London over that. We have her now. Julia Kahn, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, listen, this is a fascinating story, and basically the taxi drivers of London, first of all, I mean, we should say for our listeners that it's very hard to become a taxi driver in London. It is hard everywhere, but, they take very laborious tasks there, held to a high standard of quality, both in terms of the car and the driving and so on. And Uber is making big inroads there, and the taxi drivers in Boston held a rolling rally last month. Now there's going to be some action, or was some action in London as well. And so tell us a little bit about that just to get started.
Sure thing. I mean, the taxi industry in London really is different from the one we have here in the States. Folks are in training for upwards of 3 years before they can become drivers there. There's a lot of pride in being a black taxi driver in London. But the things they're facing are the same things drivers in the States are facing, which is these tech startup apps that are coming in and really making a really hard job even more precarious and undoing a lot of the regulations that are there to protect drivers.
Just to jump in for a second, and to protect passengers as well. I mean, they're screening, even in this country, they're screening for to make sure there's no criminal history and so on. And they say they do some of this, but, there's insurance issues. I was in a taxi cab accident myself, where there are all sorts of things around, invisible things that people take for granted that are being removed by the existence of things like Uber, right?
That's absolutely right. There's protections that are for passengers. There's protections that are just there so that if someone walking down the street gets hit by a car that happens to be a taxi, that they're going to be okay. So it's a pretty scary turn of events.
Okay. And basically, one of the points you make in your piece is, well, first of all, drivers are reacting. There was a rolling rally in Boston. How did it go in London?
In London, it was pretty huge. I spoke to a couple of drivers in London who were blown away. They gave estimates of 5,000 or 10,000 drivers out in the streets, tons of honking, and it was really fun, and the police were out trying to stop it, but of course it was a traffic jam. It was a gridlock tactic that they've used before, and they couldn't really do much about it. It drew a ton of attention. We saw it in the news here in the States, all over the world, really. And, the drivers all agreed that if the TfL, the Transit for London, doesn't pay attention to these companies like Uber coming in, that they're going to see a lot more gridlocks like this.
Well, and I think one of the challenges that people face, and your piece in Labor Notes on this makes a couple great points about this. One of the challenges that people face is that all of a sudden it's being promoted as something new and wonderful, whereas your piece, for example, points out that here's a short paragraph from you. Unlicensed drivers are not a new phenomenon in the taxi world. What's new is their acceptance. Quote, when a guy is scrambling to make a business of it, it's illegal. When Uber does it, it's suddenly an innovative business model, says somebody you interview. So I just think that's such a terrific point that, when you go to the airport, when you land in Manhattan, you go to the airport and those guys are always coming up, hey, you want to ride? You want to ride? It feels uncomfortable. But if you do it through a slick app, all of a sudden it's supposed to be cool and neat. Now, why do you think that is?
I think it's not just the slick app. I think it's the money behind the app. And a lot of the drivers I spoke with agreed. Uber is funded by Google, by Goldman Sachs, by Jeff Bezos, the guy who owns Amazon. And they just hit, I think, a marker that made them the most profitable startup, like $1.7 billion, I think, in investment. And they have money, where their mouth is. So they're going and talking to, they're lobbying, they're putting money out into communities that they're trying to get into, and it's working. They're able to create situations that work for their own interests, and I think the money behind them has a lot to do with that. That
was actually exactly the answer I was hoping you'd give, Julia.
It's the right answer.
Well, I got it from you, and I got it from your piece talk. It was such a great connection. The other great connection you made, the money behind these apps. So, and I talked earlier about the bro culture of the Silicon Valley and how they high-five each other every time they come up with something that's basically just a fancy classified ad system or whatever. But if you go behind, or in this case, switchboard, but if you go behind that to where the money is, then there's a lot riding on this. But in the end, they're dismantling a whole system of protections. They're also dismantling a way, and I'm not saying the taxi experience is perfect, but they're also dismantling a living for a lot of people. So, it's disruptive in the worst sense, which gets me to my next question, I guess, which is, on the other hand, they have an uphill pull, these taxi drivers, to communicate their case as a labor community, as a labor force, because not only do you have this money glamorizing and this culture glamorizing these, these rather quotidian apps like Uber, but you also have, people are saying, well, it's not that great to get a taxi, and I agree. So it's not always that easy to call a taxi if you got luggage and you got it, so how do they respond to that?
That's exactly right. There's a lot of problems with the taxi industry. Some of the folks I spoke to in San Diego for this article said, we're not against Uber altogether. We're against these Uber X parts that are coming in with total deregulation. And I think that my analysis is that Uber altogether is just aiming for that deregulation. They just have trot out a path for it. But a lot of the drivers I spoke to said, we're not against innovation. We're not against having apps that are helpful for matching passengers with drivers. They get that that's in their interest, which of course it is. The problem is when the apps are grounded on the backs of workers, when they're based in removing protections for passengers and for drivers. And that's really what is happening with Lyft, with UberX. But the idea of apps that connect licensed taxi drivers to passengers sounds like a pretty good deal. And the idea of regulations that maybe are a little easier to get through and are a little more fair, I think would appeal to a lot of drivers as well as to a lot of techie folks.
Yeah, and I think that this is, but of course it would be hard work, and there seems certain aversion to that in the tech community. But the other piece of it is that, I wonder to what extent these apps, whether it's Airbnb and taking them on, and or in this case, Lyft, which is a competitor to Uber, and UberX, which are really labor stories in the classic sense, among other things. I wonder to what extent this isn't also part of an attempt both to capitalize on undermining regulation and even an ideologically driven war on regulation, because you talk to these Silicon Valley guys, they're all kind of like libertarian, or not all of them, a lot of them are pretty far down the libertarian anti-government philosophy road, and I wonder to what extent there's an ideological bent to all of this too. What do you think?
I think that there definitely is. A lot of folks call this the share economy, which sounds very communitarian and progressive, and it really is a libertarian ideal. There was a recent article that I really recommend that John Carroll did in the San Francisco Chronicle about how this share economy looks like a libertarian utopia, but really it's just like the capitalist system all around it, where the big players are just taking more and more and leaving folks to scrounge for the rest. And it's really ugly. It sounds so beautiful, and it really plays out in ways that are hurting working people in every possible way.
Well, you should read what I wrote about Airbnb then, because I think we're kindred spirits, because really, they're looking for an economy where 85%, they'll tell you, Tyler Cowen, the economist, will tell you 85% of the population will be scrambling and living in shanty towns and hoping to rent out their lawnmower in their spare room. And that's the kind of economy we're fighting, and they have grandiose language behind it, but it's a fight we've been fighting for hundreds of years, and I appreciate your work on that front, Julia Kahn, organizer and staff writer for Labor Notes. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'll check out your article.
Oh, sure. Okay. Let me know what you think. Okay.
I will.
Okay. Thanks again. I'm Richard. RJ Eskow. We'll be right back after this. This is the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. With us, returning to us at the Zero Hour is Travis Waldron, who is a reporter and blogger for Think Progress at the Center for American Progress Action Fund. Travis has, among other things, he has a political background and has written on a number of topics, but is also, or has been, a sports writer. And we're now going to talk on the intersection of sports and politics and economics, another area of great interest to us here. So, Travis, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, listen, I see. Absolutely. So you've been working the Redskins beat. Now, everybody knows, I'm sure all our listeners know, most of them know, Washington Redskins, a name considered offensive, brought before the patent office, challenged on legal grounds because it is an offensive name. Patent office invalidated the name. There's going to be appeals and so on. But I guess before we get into the details of what's going on with the Redskins, you've been working this beat for a while now. What's it like to work the Redskins? I mean, it's in some ways, it's nuts that this story exists in the 21st century. What's it like working this beat?
Oh, it's fascinating. There's so many different sides to it and so many different issues of, whether it's, people arguing that it's just a name and the NFL has made that argument, the team has made that argument that it's an honor, and to hear the stories from the Native American side has been really interesting. It's been a big learning experience for me. It's easy to look at the name, I think, and see it as a racial moniker and see it as a problem, but to hear the background and the reasons why it's important to change it in the eyes of Native Americans and the activists in this fight is something that I've really learned from and gotten a much deeper understanding of both this issue but also larger Native issues that are in this context and can be put in this context. So it's been something that I've enjoyed both from a journalistic perspective, but also, as someone with an interest in the history of it and the history of how these names came about in sports and just the general history of our country.
Well, one of the things I love about your answer is, I feel the same way, is one, that just the interest in the world around us, but secondly, it sounds like you don't mind even like having your own opinions or worldview kind of stretched or altered or changed by a story you're covering. And at least that's the way I felt. That's the way I felt covering the Yes All Women. It's just, I was always considered myself a feminist, but yeah, I never thought about that. And that's for those of us who are willing to change, that's kind of a good feeling, right?
Right, I think that's it. I think, like, if you would have asked me, let's say 2 years ago, what I thought about the Redskins name, I would have said, that, yeah, it's potentially problematic. It could probably be seen as a racial moniker. It could be, I could see how it was offensive to people. I would not have understood how deeply offensive it is to a lot of people, and the history of what that word has meant to people, and also the research, the academic research that people have pointed me toward in the last year to show that how these names, and not just the Redskins, but other Native American imagery in sports kind of perpetuates larger issues that are facing the Native American community. And frankly, because they're facing the Native American community, are facing our country and people who care about addressing poverty, mental illness, alcoholism, all these different issues that are seen as very prevalent in the Native American community, they have tied back to this problem in its own way. Not to say that the Redskins name or Native American imagery solely explains any of those problems, but just that it's very intertwined with all of them.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and one of the things, you get this you get these people who say, well, here's a study that says that in the 1800s, Redskins was a word used by Native Americans themselves, therefore, it's not offensive, which I totally do not get or endorse, because, I mean, if you know anybody who speaks Yiddish, Yid is a word for Jew in Yiddish, but I don't think the Washington Yids would go over well. So why do people feel so compelled to defend this name? I mean, to me, if I called you Trav and you said, I don't like that, I'd say, okay. I wouldn't make a big issue about it's inoffensive. I just say, okay, you don't like it, I'll call you what you like to be called. Why is this something that people are academically researching and hiring lawyers? Why don't they just say, well, people find it offensive, we'll change it?
Well, I think there's a very deep psychological tie to the way we view sports and the way we view our sports teams. If you're simply a fan of this team, Redskins because of this team. You don't know that history, and you shouldn't even really be expected to know that history. It's not something that's taught, in high school or anything. We learn about Indian issues, but we don't learn the deeper side of them. And there's also a monetary aspect. If you're the team, why do you want to? This is one of the most valuable sports teams in the world, not just in the NFL, not just in the country, but in the world. And to develop a brand for 80 years and then think about changing it is a major undertaking. So, it's easy, I think, to want to defend the name if you only view it through those lenses. And it's once you're confronted with the rest of it, it makes it a lot tougher to defend. The problem is that those forces are very strong.
Well, and I think you're right, absolutely, but I think there's another dimension of it too, particularly in the conservative pushback. I'd be curious your thoughts, which is, I think there's this kind of like childlike, don't tell me what to do.
Definitely.
I like the name Redskin. Yeah, so what do you do about that?
Well, I think there's two sides of that, right? The one is childlike, I don't want to be told what to do. The other is that people don't want to be told they're racist when they don't think they're racist. And I think that's one thing that even maybe needs to be explained better is like it doesn't mean, if you think this name is just a name, it doesn't mean you're a racist. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily prejudiced. It means that you don't fully understand what this word and this name mean to the Native American community, and they are trying to do their best to educate people about that and change that. They're not, you know, a lot of the Native American activists I've talked to have said, look, we don't oppose the football team. We don't oppose the football team's fans. We oppose the name. And it's because of what that name does and what they view it as and what it means to them. So I think, you know, they've taken a very strong stance of kind of an educational approach on this toward fans. Where it's been more confrontational is toward Daniel Snyder, the team's owner, toward Roger Goodell, the NFL commissioner, because they have not really shown a willingness to engage in that educational conversation and address it as if with the respect that it probably deserves.
And, you know, look, besides the financial interests of Snyder and Goodell and everything, look, I get that change is uncomfortable. Nobody likes it. You know, I remember when Mrs. was replaced with Ms. It's like it's a habit change. People don't like change. Okay, but I mean, I guess in the minute we have left, how do we educate those people that, hey, in this case, it's important, and change is just something we need to accept? How do we educate? How do we spread that message?
I actually think the Native American activists have done a very good job of engaging in that conversation. When you see ads like the one that they produced around the Super Bowl that then ran on the NBA Finals, which was, the ad was titled Proud to Be. And it was a very basic ad that just showed Native Americans kind of living their lives. And it used a whole bunch of labels. It said things like teacher,
yeah,
mother,
we can't,
father, all of those
unfortunately,
things.
We're out of time now, unfortunately. I'd love to talk to you about this some more, but that was a great ad, and you're doing great reporting on this over at Think Progress. So, Travis Waldron, as always, thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
And that's it for this week's edition of the Zero Hour. Join us next week, same time, same place. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.